No one expected a simple backyard measurement to start a neighborhood war. But when Daniel Carter checked his property line that quiet Saturday morning, he discovered something shocking: 6 inches. That was all it was. 6 inches of land that didn't belong to the neighbor's brand new swimming pool. And yet those 6 inches changed everything. Daniel had lived in the peaceful Willow Creek neighborhood for 3 years. It was the kind of place where lawns were trimmed perfectly and neighbors smiled politely during evening walks. But the most powerful person in that neighborhood was Linda Reynolds, the president of the HOA. Linda had recently built a luxury pool behind her house. Tall glass fencing, shining blue water, and expensive stone tiles made it look like something from a magazine. Everyone admired it. Everyone except Daniel, because when Daniel checked the survey lines from the documents he received during the home purchase, something didn't make sense. The pool fence crossed over the boundary marker. At first he thought it was a mistake. Builders made errors sometimes. 6 inches wasn't much space. It could easily be corrected, so Daniel walked over calmly that afternoon and knocked on Linda's door. He explained the situation politely. He even showed her the official property survey, but instead of concern, Linda smiled with quiet confidence. She told him the HOA approved the construction. She told him the boundary lines had already been reviewed. Then she said something that made Daniel pause. 6 inches isn't worth causing trouble, Daniel. That moment changed everything, because Daniel wasn't trying to cause trouble. He was trying to understand why the HOA president believed she could simply take part of his land. And what Linda didn't realize in that moment was that Daniel had already begun looking deeper into the situation. What he was about to uncover would shock the entire neighborhood. And the 6 inches of land would soon become the most expensive mistake Linda Reynolds had ever made. But the real story had only just begun. Daniel didn't sleep well that night. Something about Linda's calm confidence didn't sit right with him. Most people would at least check the documents again. But Linda acted like the conversation was already finished. The next morning Daniel opened the folder that contained his house survey documents. Every detail was clear. Every measurement was precise, and the boundary line definitely ran exactly 6 inches away from Linda's new pool fence. Daniel decided to double-check everything before pushing the issue further. He contacted a professional land surveyor to verify the property lines again. 2 days later, bright orange markers appeared in the grass between the properties. The surveyor walked carefully along the boundary while measuring equipment blinked quietly in the sunlight. When he finished, he handed Daniel the results. The fence didn't just cross slightly, it crossed exactly 6 inches into Daniel's property. Daniel felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. It wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The measurements were official, so Daniel politely sent Linda a message explaining the new survey results and asking if she would move the fence slightly to respect the property boundary. Hours passed, then a reply arrived, but it wasn't from Linda, it was from the HOA board. The message said the pool had already been approved under HOA construction rules and no changes would be required. Daniel read the message twice. Approved? How could the HOA approve something that crossed a legal property line? That was when he realized something important. Linda wasn't just a neighbor, she was the HOA president, and the board that approved the project worked under her authority. At that moment Daniel understood something else too. If the HOA thought they could quietly ignore the law, they had clearly underestimated the quiet man living next door, because Daniel wasn't finished asking questions. In fact, he had just started gathering the evidence that would change everything, and the next step would put the entire HOA leadership in a very uncomfortable position. Instead of arguing with the HOA, Daniel chose a different approach. He stayed quiet and began documenting everything carefully: photos of the pool fence, copies of both surveys, screenshots of HOA emails. Every detail went into a growing folder on his computer. At first glance the situation looked small. 6 inches of land hardly sounded like a big problem. But Daniel understood something most people ignored: property lines were not suggestions, they were legal boundaries. If someone crossed them without permission, it wasn't just rude. It could create serious legal consequences. Still, Daniel gave Linda one more chance. He walked over calmly one evening while the sun reflected across the sparkling water of her new pool. Neighbors nearby admired the design while chatting along the sidewalk. Daniel politely explained that the new survey confirmed the fence crossed onto his property. He asked again if she would consider adjusting it. Linda listened for a moment before shaking her head. Her answer was simple: the HOA already approved everything. Then she added something that surprised Daniel even more: if you keep pushing this, you could violate HOA harmony rules. Daniel stood there silently. HOA harmony rules. He had never heard anyone threaten a homeowner with something like that before. That was the moment Daniel realized this was no longer about 6 inches of land, this was about power. Linda believed the HOA gave her authority over the situation, but what she didn't realize was that the HOA couldn't rewrite property law. Daniel thanked her politely and walked back home. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he opened his laptop that night and scheduled a meeting with a real estate attorney. Because if Linda believed HOA approval made her untouchable, she was about to discover something very different, and once the legal process began, the 6 inches of land would turn into a problem much bigger than a backyard pool. The attorney listened carefully as Daniel explained the situation. After reviewing the surveys and HOA messages, she leaned back in her chair and smiled slightly. "This case is actually very simple," she said. She explained that property lines were legally binding. No HOA approval could override them. If a structure crossed onto someone else's land without permission, the owner had the right to demand removal. Daniel nodded slowly, but he didn't want a messy legal fight. All he wanted was fairness, so the attorney suggested sending a formal legal notice first. The letter explained clearly that Linda's pool fence was built 6 inches over the boundary and must be corrected within 30 days. When Linda received the letter, the reaction was immediate. Suddenly, the confident HOA president wanted a meeting. She knocked on Daniel's door with a much different tone than before. Linda tried to suggest compromises. Maybe Daniel could simply allow the fence to stay and sign a property adjustment agreement, but Daniel calmly declined. He wasn't interested in selling part of his yard. He simply wanted the property line respected. The meeting ended politely, but tension spread through the neighborhood quickly. People whispered during evening walks. Some neighbors quietly supported Daniel, others believed challenging the HOA president was a dangerous move. Weeks passed. Then the 30-day deadline arrived, and nothing changed. The pool fence remained exactly where it was. That was when Daniel's attorney filed the official complaint with the county. Within days, a legal order arrived. Linda had built part of her structure on someone else's property, and legally, it had to be removed. But removing it wouldn't be simple, because the pool design connected the fence to the stone deck surrounding the water. Adjusting the boundary would require breaking part of the expensive construction. For the first time since the project began, Linda's perfect backyard faced a very serious problem. And the neighborhood was about to witness a twist no one expected. The legal process moved faster than anyone in Willow Creek expected. Once the county reviewed the surveys and documents, the ruling was clear. The pool structure crossed onto Daniel's property, and the law was very specific about what had to happen next. The section built over the boundary had to be removed. Linda tried one last appeal through the HOA board. But even the board members understood they couldn't override county property law. Quietly, the board stepped back. Suddenly, Linda stood alone. The same confidence she once showed during their first conversation was gone. Neighbors watched closely as contractors returned to her backyard. But this time they weren't building something new. They were carefully marking the exact 6-inch section that crossed the boundary. Daniel didn't celebrate. He simply watched from his window as the workers explained the situation to Linda, because the stone deck had been built as one continuous structure. Removing the 6-inch section required breaking a portion of the pool edge and rebuilding it inside the correct boundary. The sound of construction filled the neighborhood again, except this time it wasn't the sound of progress, it was the sound of a costly correction. The repair work took days. Large pieces of stone were removed, adjusted, and replaced. The elegant design Linda once proudly showed to neighbors now carried a visible reminder of the mistake. But the most surprising moment came near the end of the process. When the contractors finished, they placed the new fence exactly along the correct boundary line, and for the first time since the entire situation began, Linda looked directly at Daniel. Her expression wasn't angry, it was quiet, because the lesson had become impossible to ignore. Powerful titles inside an HOA didn't change property law. And 6 inches of land had just turned into one of the most expensive lessons in the entire neighborhood. But the final twist of the story was still waiting. After the construction ended, Willow Creek slowly returned to its usual calm rhythm. Lawns were trimmed again. Evening walks continued. On the surface, everything looked normal, but something had quietly changed in the neighborhood. People had watched the entire situation unfold. They saw how confident the HOA leadership had been in the beginning, and they saw how quickly that confidence disappeared when the law became involved. For the first time, many homeowners started asking questions about HOA authority. At the next community meeting, attendance doubled. Neighbors politely asked about transparency, approvals, and how decisions were being made. Linda sat at the front table as HOA president, but her voice carried less certainty than before. The board introduced new policies requiring independent verification of property boundaries before approving major construction. In a quiet way, Daniel's situation had changed the rules for everyone. But Daniel himself never tried to embarrass Linda or celebrate the outcome. When neighbors asked about the situation, he simply said something simple: it was never about the pool. It was about respect. Respect for property lines, respect for neighbors, respect for rules that apply to everyone equally. Over time, the tension slowly faded. Linda eventually stepped down from her role as HOA president the following year. A new board was elected with promises of clearer communication. And the strange story about 6 inches of land became a neighborhood legend people quietly mentioned during backyard conversations. But the final truth behind the story was something many people didn't realize until much later. Because Daniel never intended to fight anyone, he simply believed something very simple: rules were meant to protect fairness, and once fairness returned, the entire neighborhood became a better place. Still, one final moment would soon reveal the most surprising twist of all. Months after the repairs were finished, Daniel was planting new flowers along the edge of his backyard when Linda approached the fence quietly. It was the first time they had spoken since the construction ended. She looked at the new boundary line for a moment before speaking, then she surprised him. Linda apologized, not a defensive apology or an excuse, a real one. She admitted that during the construction she believed her role as HOA president meant the approvals would protect her decisions, but the situation had taught her something important: authority didn't replace fairness. And ignoring a neighbor's concern had been a mistake. Daniel listened quietly and nodded. He told her he never wanted the situation to become a neighborhood conflict, he simply wanted the property line respected. Linda smiled slightly and thanked him for staying calm throughout the entire situation. After that day, the conversations between them slowly became normal again. They occasionally greeted each other during evening walks like ordinary neighbors, and the rebuilt section of the pool quietly remained as a reminder of the strange conflict that once divided the neighborhood. Years later, people still told the story during community gatherings, not because of the pool, not because of the 6 inches, but because it proved something simple and powerful. Even in a place full of rules and authority, fairness still mattered most. And sometimes the smallest piece of land could teach the biggest lesson, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.